Okay, Quay. Hello. Don DeLuisi, Mary Beth Doucette. I'm pleased to be sharing this information with you about the Berdora Lakes CEPI research project, one of the Shared Future research projects that's based in Mi'kmaq territory in the district of Unama'ki, Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. This is the third video of a number of short videos that I've pre-recorded to facilitate knowledge sharing of the preliminary results of the Shared Future CEPI research project. As in every presentation, I want to start by quickly reviewing the project objectives and highlighting where we are in the process. A more detailed description of the research process was provided in presentation 1. If you haven't reviewed that video yet, I encourage you to go back and do so. For this research project, there are two overarching goals. First, we want to understand the possibilities, pitfalls, and complexities of implementing Etowaptimunk two-eyed seeing within a long-term intersectoral partnership focused on human land health. And secondly, we want to foster reflexivity, co-learning, and reconciliation within the CEPI by deepening CEPI members' understandings of Etowaptimunk two-eyed seeing while strengthening your and our capacity and commitment to enact two-eyed seeing. In this video, I will be talking about the CEPI organizational identity and the relationships that the CEPI has with other organizations. I'll start by explaining why we decided that the CEPI identity is an important theme to discuss with this group. Then I'll present a few fundamental aspects of organizational identities and specifically elements of the CEPI organizational identity, including vision, mission, and purpose. And then I'll provide examples of complexities and pitfalls and possibilities that came through in the interviews as we do in other videos. Finally, I'll present the reflection and discussion questions that we hope you will join us to discuss in the virtual co-learning sessions in November. So I'm starting this conversation about organizational identity by introducing concepts that are very common in the field of organizational studies: organizational vision and purpose. And in honor and recognition of the significant contributions that one individual, Charlie Joe Dennis, had made to the CEPI, we start by providing quotes from the interviewees where his vision for the group was referenced. Charlie's leadership and vision was referenced in almost every interview, and so we wanted to select a few that that demonstrated the ways in which his leadership was referenced. So for example, in this quote, they talked about challenges that came with having so many different people and different intentions sitting around the table. And what the challenge was, well, it was a challenge because there's so many groups and so many different mindsets. But with somebody like Charlie at the helm, he was a master of being able to get people working together. I guess we'll miss him. In another interview, somebody spoke about Charlie's magic. He got 3 RDGs, 4 deputy ministers from the province. He got all 5 chiefs and councillors, and he persisted until he got every single signature, 19 signatures on that document in reference to the Berdora Lakes Charter. And so there was no doubt that Charlie provided the vision for what would become the Berdora Lakes Collaborative Environmental Planning Initiative. According to at least one interviewee, his vision for the CEPI was heavily informed by his experiences with the Middle Shoal case. And so on this slide, we show you the timeline that points out the difference in time between 1996 and 2005. Because for those of you who don't know, the decision from the Middle Shoal case was delivered in 1996. At that time, LNG had received permission from the government to dredge the lake bottom in the area of the Little Narrows Channel, so that larger shipping boats could access the interior portions of the lakes. However, Charlie wasn't happy about the dredging efforts. He feared it would be too disruptive to the Berdora ecosystem, and he discussed his concerns with federal representatives from Fisheries and Oceans. At that time, he had requested that a form of ecological impact assessment be provided before the dredging could proceed. And as the story goes, his concerns were ignored and the dredging proceeded anyhow. So with the support of the Union of Nova Scotia Indians, Charlie Joe successfully charged the government, and the decision that was delivered in 1996 said that the government had failed in their duty to consult the Mi'kmaq. So, although the decision was favorable in favor of the Mi'kmaq, it had detrimental impacts in the relationship between the various government and community stakeholders. Um, and as explained in this quote from one interviewee, this was well before the duty to consult became popular. And although LNG never went back, they never finished their project, and they never challenged the court decision, you now had very broken relationships between the 5 First Nations and DFO and Environment Canada. And so that, according to this interview, was when and how CEPI was born. Charlie, being the diplomat he invited DFO and Environment Canada and Indian Affairs to have a meeting with the 5 chiefs to try and repair the damage. And the meeting that he referred to was almost 10 years later, the 2003 Bredor Lakes Workshop. And then 2 years after that, the Bredor Charter was signed. So in this process, we decided it was appropriate to review the details of the Bredor Charter here because it outlines the vision. It outlines the vision, the purpose, and the objectives for the CEPI. It has 17 signatures, 5 Unama'ki chiefs, 5 regionally elected town and county councillors, 3 provincial deputy ministers, and 3 federal regional directors. It says that by signing the Bredor Charter, we commit to work together to pursue the vision, purpose, and objectives outlined for the Bredor Lakes watershed by the Collaborative Environmental Planning Initiative, and it was signed on November 23rd, 2005 in Eskasoni. So I know this is small print, and so I copied the vision, purpose, and objectives over from the document. The CEPI vision is to lead a unique collaboration of partners that incorporate both traditional Mi'kmaq and Western perspectives in order to foster a healthy and productive Bredor Lakes watershed ecosystem. While the CEPI purpose is to develop an overall management plan for the Bredor Lakes watershed ecosystem and to facilitate its implementation by governments and other relevant stakeholders. Finally, the CEPI objectives are that a balance of environmental, social, cultural, and institutional objectives will be pursued to ensure the health and sustainable use of the Bredor watershed ecosystem. I think it's also important to note here that the objectives have been periodically reviewed, and we found that there was nothing wrong with the terms of reference or the charter. And so the theme of this presentation is the CEPI identity and CEPI relationships. And we want to discuss the CEPI identity and CEPI relationships with everyone because in the interviews, they came through as critically important aspects of the collaborative activities. They also came through as points of complexity and tension. And so the quotes that we provided next will highlight some of the complexities of working with multiple diverse groups. But first, I want to provide an often referenced academic definition of organizational identity. And my hope is that it might direct your thoughts as you think about the points we raise. So, organizational identity consists of 3 claims: the criterion of claimed central character, claimed distinctiveness, and claimed temporal continuity. And now, so there are 2 general thoughts among those who study organizations. On the one hand, organizations have attributes that define an underlying character. On the other hand, organizational identity can function as a strategic resource, as a guide to orient strategic decision making. And so I'm not going to commit to one definition. I think it's important that we consider both the attributes that can be claimed by the CEPI and how the idea of a CEPI organizational identity can be leveraged to guide our decision making in the future. And so as I review the quotes from the interviews, I invite you to think about these questions. Does CEPI have a central identity and character, and what makes it distinct? What attributes, if any, have been consistently embraced and enacted over time? And so the question that continually came up in discussions loosely centered around the idea of the CEPI identity and what it was. The question is, what does CEPI do? There were three themes in the responses that came through, and they centered around planning, actions and initiatives, and the process of collaborating. So in this first quote, it's a planning initiative. So the only research questions they should be supporting are the ones that are related to the larger plan. There's no larger plan yet, and the CEPI's been in existence for a long time. And so CEPI could be a lot further along, but it's important not to go off in too many directions. Um, and so other interviewees described CEPI as a process in comparison to a plan. And so for people to understand that this is a process was a bit of a learning curve for some. How come we can't do can't just do this and this and this and be done with it? But it's more than that. You have to evolve and you have to take into account what the lake itself is telling you. And so that quote speaks more to the value of process as opposed to a plan. Um, and then in the final quote that's here, demonstrated in this interview, there's also the complexity of disentangling which members around the table are doing the work. So when you compare UINR, the Unama'ki Institute of Natural Resources, and the CEPI is action-oriented, according to this interviewee. And that's obvious. The actions have to be taken. Sometimes, you have to rely on one or two individuals who wear multiple hats of jurisdiction. And so the question of what does CEPI do and how is that part of CEPI's identity comes through in different interviews. And so the problem or the pitfall of not having a shared common understanding of which attributes of the CEPI identity are most important um, is that people around the table will have a hard time agreeing on when and where to focus their efforts. So interviewees expressed doubt about whether the CEPI, the Collaborative Planning Initiative, would ever produce a plan. As in this interview, there was concern that if the CEPI way is not a planning way, that is to develop a plan and then have that plan incorporated into legislation and regulation by empowered agencies. If that's not the approach, and according to this interviewee, that has not been the approach um, that CEPI's interested, then what? It may mean that people will back away from their involvement in the CEPI. And when we talked about the need for a plan, some people, other interviewees, to pointed to the People of the Lake Speak document as a plan, although it didn't meet everyone's expectations. So my problem with it, the People of the Lake Speak 2011 document, is that it doesn't give any direction for action. I love all the things, all the sentiments in it, but I don't find it's a document that will enable you to have programs. So there was also an expressed tension about when the plan should be completed. Um, in the last quote that's there wasn't necessarily a duration because again, it kind of depends on how you define a plan. Maybe somebody might consider it more of a framework or a process. And so the pitfalls we see with an organizational identity that is poorly defined or misunderstood is that people will see value in the organization, not see where their skill set fits around the table, or they may have trouble deciding where and when their energy can be best spent. So unlike in the last presentation, the possibilities we'd like to consider in this presentation do not come directly from the interviews. And so we return to the definitions of organizational identities. Does CEPI have core attributes? I also want to present this quote to zoom in on or center the thought of CEPI as a discussion table. It's not to say that jurisdiction will not have a role to play in this later, but right now, let's get into a deep discussion as to how we can humbly and honestly embrace the spirit of collaboration. So related to that, I want to also think about the strategic value of the CEPI identity. Um, And with that in mind, I propose the following three possibilities. What if we leverage the central attribute of CEPI as a discussion table and demonstrate the value in collaborative discussions for co-learning and networking regarding important watershed issues, for example, conferences and steering committees? And what if we position CEPI as a unique organizational structure and a unique model for reconciliation? Um, what if we script a common narrative to raise and maintain awareness about the CEPI mandate, priorities, plans, and projects with communities in the Bredor Lakes watershed? So we want to discuss these questions with you in real time over Zoom. Um, and so we want you to please consider these questions and then join us for the online interactive discussion later in November. I've added some questions here. So what is CEPI's reason for being? What is the value to members and the watershed communities? How are the vision and objectives being communicated to broader Unama'ki Cape Breton communities? Does the CEPI have a central character? What makes it distinct? And what attributes, if any, have been consistently embraced or enacted over time? And now we ask you to please contact Carolyn Barber by email to register for the Zoom sessions, all or part of them. Sebi can also answer any, Carolyn can also answer any questions you might have about the process. Likewise, you can contact myself, Mary Beth Doucette at cpu.ca. We hope to see you soon. Here's the final list, temporary proposed list of timeline events for the 6 topics and when we'll be discussing them live. Thank you, Walalin, Namoltis. We'll see you soon.